Who's more likely to develop IBS, men or women? If you ask the researchers, they're going to tell you women are more likely, Robert. But I would argue that and say that people that are most likely to develop IBS are the ones that are destroying and damaging their gut, either knowingly or unknowingly. There are certainly other triggers for IBS that we didn't go into. For example, alcohol can be a trigger. Coffee can be a trigger for IBS. Caffeine can be a trigger. So who's most likely to suffer from it? According to the research, women are, but men, there's an equal opportunity for men to struggle there as well. Are SIBO and IBS related? Yes and no. SIBO is really, in my opinion, SIBO is really not a condition. SIBO is a state of gas production, and that's not a condition. So what is SIBO? That stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And to diagnose it, doctors will measure whether or not you're producing excessive hydrogen or excessive methane gases. So they'll measure these two gases in your gut based on first giving you a bunch of sugar. So they'll load you up with sugar, and then they'll see how much methane and hydrogen you produce. And kind of the way the test works is if either the methane or the hydrogen levels come back too high, they're going to say that you have too much bacteria growing inside of you. And I disagree with that. I don't think that parameter is accurate. I think if you feed yourself a bunch of sugar and you're intolerant to that sugar and you develop methane and hydrogen, it's probably closer to an irritable bowel issue than it is actually a SIBO issue. Now, that's not to say that some people don't feel better when they take like a natural antibiotic or an antibiotic, but I look at that as going back to this, right? Bacteria, yeast, and parasites. So less of a normal bacterial overgrowth in the gut and more of an abnormal type of bacterial overgrowth in the gut, which in my opinion is what a lot of doctors today are calling SIBO. Let's see. As far as plantain chips, Mark's asking about plantain chips being dried or fried. Both, depends on how you buy them. Are they healthy is the bigger question, and no. I mean, fried chips aren't good for you. I don't care whether they're gluten-free or not. Now, plantains, traditionally, they are a gluten-free chip. That being said, are they good for you if you're eating a bunch of fried plantains every day instead of eating a bunch of fried corn chips? No, they're still not good for you. So remember the cardinal rule of nutrition. You can't get healthy eating food that's not. Let's see. Does the body, when under stress from antibiotics or antacids, does the body process plant protein different from meat protein? No, Cynthia, it doesn't. Protein requires acid to break it down. Now, that being said, meat protein is a bigger bolus of protein. So pound for pound, meat is concentrated in protein versus the other macronutrients, whereas plants are generally a mixture of carbohydrates and proteins. But even still, remember, if your gut is under duress or stress, it can be just as challenging to digest meat as it can be certain plant-based products. And so that's unique to the individual, and that's what testing can help rule out. So, Tracy's asking about my opinion on mediator release testing and LEAP nutritionist services for food sensitivities. They're not objective. They're all over the place. I don't like them, but that's my opinion. Yeah, Elizabeth's saying most of the tests you're mentioning are not recommended or not administered in New York City. How can I get around that? You're not going to like my answer, Elizabeth. Move. New York is one of the most, in my opinion, criminal enterprises in medicine, in that they don't allow their citizens to have intelligent, meaningful conversations with doctors to get things done that are beyond the standard of care. And doctors aren't willing to even have that conversation. And so if you can't do it yourself, if you can't put your health in your own hands, and the doctors aren't willing to even entertain it, then what does that leave you with? I know a lot of people in New York, they'll drive over state lines to see a doctor who will run these types of tests or to get these types of tests done. So that's another, if you're not up to moving, that's just another option for you. Let's see here. Can unresolved IBS lead to colorectal cancer? I haven't seen any direct research that says IBS over time unresolved causes or leads to or contributes to colorectal cancer, but I would surmise just from an educated perspective that, yeah, it could. I mean, you have to understand what I just showed you is that IBS contributes to leaky gut, and leaky gut contributes to GI inflammation and systemic inflammation. And anytime we have chronic systemic inflammation where the immune system's being overwhelmed, we increase our risk for the development of cancer. As a matter of fact, I talked a number of years ago at the conference, The Truth About Cancer, and that was actually the subject of my discussion, was how autoimmune disease is actually a form of pre-cancer, meaning once you start developing autoimmune processes, the likelihood of going on to develop cancer, it's much, much higher. So yes, I do believe that unresolved IBS problems could potentially lead in that direction. So the bloating can cause extreme fatigue, Dahlia, because when the bloating is occurring, it's not bloating in a vacuum. You're not just seeing bloating. You're also, remember what I said earlier, you're seeing bloating, but you're seeing leaky gut and inflammation. And the inflammation uses up your body's internal resources, right? Those toxic byproducts are leaking into your bloodstream. What do you think that's going to do to your energy? It's going to make your body focus all of its energy production on helping to neutralize those toxins instead of producing energy for you to heal, repair, and function and maintain your body. So it's a very common side effect is poor energy. Is there a certain area in the gut that you'd feel the pain and the type of pain? Scroll down just a fuzz there on the right. Yeah, so okay, so Nicole's just wondering, is there an area of the gut where you're going to feel pain and what type of pain? With IBS, I mean, generally speaking, it's below the stomach. So if the stomach is here, we go just below that to the small intestines and a little bit below that, just above the hips to the large intestine. And so you can feel pain in any of those areas, whether on the left side or the right side. So kind of depends on where that blockage or where that backup is occurring as to where that distension and how your nerves connect to your bowel as to where that pain is going to manifest for you. Should I ask my doctor about being tested for bile malabsorption? So bile, there's no real test for bile acid malabsorption. But there are tests for gallbladder. There's something called a HIDA scan, which is you can test how well your gallbladder is pushing bile into your small intestine. I would say, though, don't put too much faith in a test like that. Those tests, in my experience, are oftentimes used for doctors to justify removing a gallbladder surgically, and it's one of the most commonly performed surgical procedures, and oftentimes it's not necessary, in my opinion. You got to understand if there's a bile issue, that can be backtracked. Bile, you require certain nutrients to produce bile. The liver's got to be healthy to produce bile. And so remember, if just like I said here, if you've got toxic byproducts that are spilling into your immune system, your portal circulation, which is your liver, and I think I drew that actually back over here. So let's just go back one here. Did I? No, maybe I didn't draw it, or maybe I already erased it. But my point is this: your liver. So your bloodstream, right? Your bloodstream. So once it goes to your immune system, which is your gall, the next area that it goes to is your liver, and then your liver hopefully will process it before it goes into the main systemic circulation. And so if this is happening to you, your liver's taking on a lot of damage. And if you're having a gall problem or a gallbladder problem, remember your gallbladder is a part of your liver, so it's a natural progression. And we're actually going to be talking about gluten in the liver and the gallbladder next week. We're going to do a deep dive on the liver and the gallbladder, but this is a very common manifestation of symptoms here as a result of this problem. And if you fix this problem can resolve. And so a lot of times getting the gallbladder surgically removed is a premature notion. It's being done before it's necessary. Can you have a yeast overgrowth and it's not showing up on a stool sample? Yes, you can have a systemic candida overgrowth, and that can be measured too in the bloodstream. My thoughts on taking oregano oil to help IBS or SIBO. I think it's a shot in the dark. I think if you're going to do anything about what you suspect IBS or SIBO, I think you need to get appropriately tested. Question about how leaky gut is measured. There are a lot of different ways it's measured. There's no great single test to measure leaky gut. Some doctors and some researchers look at sugar absorption across the barrier of the GI tract. So measuring sugar as it shows up in your blood. Some doctors are looking at antibodies to what are called lipopolysaccharides, or LPS, which are different types of bacterial endotoxins that are present more in the bloodstream when there's the potential for a leaky gut. However, you got to remember that you've got bacteria in your bloodstream even if you don't have a leaky gut, and so it's possible to have LPS that are elevated beyond that. So beyond that, they're coming from the GI tract. So when we look at measuring leaky gut, we look at the different triggers and factors that are known to cause leaky gut. One of the things I would encourage any of you who are interested in learning more about leaky gut, in 2 weeks, you're going to get an email from me. So if you're not on my email list, go get on my email list. You can do that at glutenfreesociety.org. Just sign up for my newsletter. It's free. And all we're really going to do is send you a ton of really great information that'll help you learn. But in about 2 weeks, I'm going to be sending out a registration link where you'll be able to access not only my glutenology masterclass, but you'll also be able to get access. We just finished up probably the most comprehensive course on leaky gut ever produced. And it's almost 2 hours long. And we talk all about the triggers of leaky gut, and it's just too much in depth to get into in tonight's class. But we talk about leaky gut and measuring leaky gut as well. Can supplementation with potassium and glutamine help with slow motility and IBS? Yes. I mean, if potassium is low, if you're not low in potassium, taking more is not really going to do a whole heck of a lot for you. Glutamine can be helpful, but again, that can also be measured, just like potassium can be measured. So again, if you're taking supplements like drugs to alleviate your symptoms, that might not be the best move to make. Can lectins open up tight junctions like gluten? Yes, some of them can. Which food-specific sensitivity test do you recommend? Anna's asking. It's not one test, Anna. That's the whole deal. It's multiple tests that measure in multiple different ways. How valid is red meat being associated with IBS, colon cancer? It's propaganda, in my opinion. I'm not going to get too deep into it. I mean, I'm not going to say there's no viable research at all that says that eating meat can create certain types of byproducts or compounds. That being said, I think a lot of researchers are making huge suggestive, interpretive leaps at getting to cancer from byproducts that are being produced in the gut. Now, some people do thrive better on a vegetarian diet, that being said, and some people thrive better on a heavier meat-based diet. So that also is unique to the individual. Scroll down on the left. Yeah, scroll down on the right too. If grains are deleterious to health, why does the government recommend so much of it? Why does the government do a lot of things that don't make sense? I mean, the government also lied about fat, right? And they blamed heart disease and diabetes on fat instead of blaming it on sugar. Government also recommended a food guide pyramid that had sugar on it as a food, right? Sugar's not a food. Sugar's a highly processed byproduct that we know causes illness and disease. I mean, your government has a long-standing history. Our government, as much as, I believe in our country and I believe in, I served our country, but I don't always agree with what politicians try to do. And when they try to, force special interests down our throat, you have to look at where the food guide pyramid recommendations came from. They didn't come from nutritionists. They didn't come and ask my opinion. They didn't come and ask some of the great leaders' opinions. What they did is they got a bunch of lobbyists in a room and they said, who wants the bottom of the pyramid, who wants to spend the most money? And that just happened to be the grain industry. So they got away with basically buying their spots on the food guide pyramid, and you all grew up with the cartoon commercials and everything else that promoted that nonsense, and you took it as truth because most people didn't question it. And you got to understand, doctors don't go when they go through school, they don't take nutrition, so they don't question it because they don't know any better to question it. So that leaves doctors like myself kind of out on a limb. We're kind of floating in this area where we're always in this danger zone where we're being threatened by governances and state boards for speaking the truth. Also, the government can get away with subsidizing your taxpayer dollars to grow grains that are actually poisons than to feed you those poisons, so that the same companies that are growing those grains, receiving those tax subsidies, that also own the pharmaceutical companies, can then feed you your drugs for the rest of your life to treat the grain-induced and sugar-induced illnesses that they fed you. It's a very, very big system that is very well oiled, and it needs to go away. And the only way that's going to go away is for each of you that are watching this to question it, right? To question it. If the government's recommendations are so accurate, why do we have more cancer, more heart disease, more diabetes, more osteoporosis, more obesity than we've ever seen in the history of mankind? It's based on those recommendations. So how right are they? At a certain point, we have to look up from the ground and we have to ask, what's the empirical data say? Not what does the special interest research study that was funded by Coca-Cola say, but what does the actual outcome look like? The outcome is horrific. People are being murdered by their plates and forks, and it's being socially justified as love. And you know, we keep going on because it's hard. It's hard to deviate away from the social norm and to make those changes. That's why we don't say gluten-free pacifist around here. We say gluten-free warrior, because you have to have a warrior mentality to go in and actually do the right thing. And if you don't, and it's very, very hard to navigate because other people around you are pressuring you, calling you a food nut, calling you crazy, calling you a health nut, saying that being healthy is not important as being socially acceptable by eating this poison. Like you get all these people with all these ideas and ramifications, but none of them are right. I harped on that a little bit. Let's see here. Why do some doctors think leaky gut is a myth? Because they don't read literature. A lot of your doctors today, they're in practice, they're seeing 50, 60 people, you know, in an 8-hour day. They don't have time to read. It's all they can do to keep their head above water, and all their education comes from pharmaceutical funded postgraduate hours where they get paid to go on this trip to this place or that place and be educated about how great this drug is or how great that drug is. It's, you know, most of the industry, it's special interest, and that's part of the big problem. And so they don't read literature, they don't read research, so they don't even think much about leaky gut. There are thousands. I think at last check, over 18,000 studies that have been published with intestinal permeability and leaky gut in the actual study itself. So how could it not be real if there's over 18,000 publications? It makes sense to me that we ought to start looking at it and calling it a real thing. Is it okay to use digestive enzymes daily to help stop IBS symptoms from happening? Yes. Digestive enzymes are one of the things you can do very safely. It doesn't hurt you to do it. And oftentimes, when your gut's compromised and your digestive capacity is compromised, sometimes using digestive enzymes can help dig you out of that hole. It's best to avoid trigger foods, though. So again, if you're using my gluten shield, right, so that you can go eat a sandwich, that's not the proper use of gluten shield. The proper use of gluten shield would be to not eat the sandwich. But if you're eating out because you're traveling, would be to take it prophylactically in case you get cross-contamination. You're trying to put down some protection for that cross-contamination. But no enzymes should justify you eating something that your body can't process or tolerate. Okay, let's go down on both sides there. IBS-C, I feel like I'm constantly taking supplements and still suffer. It's so frustrating. My entire day revolves around, will my stomach hurt today? Tracy, you got to get tested. I mean, that's the best thing you can do is find you a good, functional doc and get tested. Let's see. Okay, go back up on the right. Just all the way up. There were a couple of questions there I want to come back to as we run it down. So, can your protein shakes be used in a mostly carnivore diet? Does collagen block iron? No, collagen doesn't block iron, and yes, my protein shakes can be used in a mostly carnivore diet. They're derived from beef. Can emotional problems cause IBS or can emotional trauma cause problems with IBS? And if it can, what do you recommend in terms of therapies? I think one of my favorite therapies for emotional trauma, if you're over the trauma itself. So what happens with trauma a lot of times, so you got some type of emotional trauma. Trauma, just like bad food, sets up the stage for inflammation. And the reason why is that this actually happens through hormones. Your cortisol, insulin, dysregulation of these hormones contribute to elevations in blood sugar leading to inflammation. So once this process starts, even if you're beyond the trauma, the process is still there. It's kind of like if you roll over a nail and pop your tire, you can take the nail out, you can take the trauma away, but the inflammation, the popped tire is still there. So it's, one of the best ways to deal with trauma if you've psychologically resolved the trauma in your mind. So the step one is if you've suffered emotional trauma, this has to be resolved in your own mind. And there are a number of different ways you can do that. You can get professional help. You can see a psychiatrist, you can see a psychologist, you can see a pastor or priest. You can see, if you're married, your spouse, right? Sometimes your spouse is your best counsel because that's the person you should absolutely be able to trust and tell anything. And they oftentimes can be very, very helpful in this kind of regard to helping you understand and resolve what happened. So there's a number of professional ways. There's also a number of ways within your community you can get help in that way. And if that's something that you value and that's something you feel like you need, definitely would seek that out. So that can be done. But if we're talking about, okay, you've already resolved this, but the damage of all that trauma is still there, one of the best things that you can do in your mind, like to calm down your mind, is something called sensory deprivation. This is actually one of my favorite therapies. Sensory deprivation, sometimes also referred to as a float tank. Research on this was done 50 years ago, and what they actually were using, they used LSD in float tanks. Float tanks are basically huge bathtubs full of magnesium. So much magnesium, so like an average float tank has about 1,000 pounds of magnesium. So magnesium so thick and in the water so dense that you float. That's why they call them float tanks. So you're buoyant. So if you've ever been to the Dead Sea and got in the water, you can't sink because there's so much mineral salt in the water that you're buoyant comparative to the water, and so you float. Well, same principle here, only they have them now where you can just type in float tank, do a search. You'll pull up, there are centers in every major city across the United States where you can go and float. And what floating is again, you're floating in this bath of magnesium. So the water is the temperature equals your body temp. Okay, so that takes away sensory sensation. Remember, this is sensory deprivation. We're depriving you of sensation is basically what we're doing. So the temperature of the water is the temperature of your body. So we're depriving you of any fluctuations in external temperature. So we're masking your external receptors in your skin to measure changes and fluctuations in temperature. So we're depriving you of that sense, right? You're blindfolded. So we're depriving you of the sensation of sight. You have earplugs in. So we're depriving you of hearing, and you're in the dark. Again, so between the blind and being in the dark, so you're laying in a big pool of water, floating. Okay, you can't see, you can't hear. It's dark. You can't feel temperature change. And on top of that, as you're floating, we're taking away gravity force. So you don't feel the fluctuations in your nerves. So your nerves are constantly sending messages. You have little tiny proprioceptors in your joints, muscles, tendons that send messages back to your brain about your position in space. And this is why when you walk, you don't fall over as part of your balance system. So, but when you're floating, you're taking away those different receptors quit firing. And so you're taking away the sensation of balance. So again, we're depriving you of multiple sensations while you're in that tank, and what you're left with is your brain. It's you and your brain lying there in the water, and so you're left with your own thoughts, right? And so depending on what your thoughts are like, for most people, that first 10 minutes in a float tank, if you've never done it before, that first 10 minutes is kind of self-talk. You're just laying there thinking, why am I in this float tank? This is a ridiculous notion. This isn't going to be helpful. And 10 minutes goes by before you know it, and now all of a sudden your brainwaves, the pattern starts to change. And what that pattern change of sensory deprivation It helps to skyrocket the balance of cortisol and insulin. So it really helps to think of it as almost like an adrenal reset program. When I'm under heavy stress, I'll go get in a float tank and I'm good for months. I don't have to worry about it unless just the stress is never ending and unending. But if I've resolved the stress, this is one of the quickest ways to reset the trauma that came from that stress, the chemical byproduct that came from that stress. So the float tank is one of my favorite therapies in that regard. Oh, I love that. Best thing I ever did was call Dr. Osborne's office. Don't wait all my many issues are slowly going away. Thanks for that. I love hearing people say that because, I mean, like I said, health is complex. It's not do it yourself. I mean, it's one thing if you're not really struggling, you're just trying to be healthier, so you're biohacking your way to see what affects you and what doesn't affect you. It's a totally different story, though, if you're struggling with an illness and you've been struggling for years and years and years. You don't want to just continue to struggle in that regard. Let's see here. Can I flavor ultra electrolytes in water with lemon essential oil or stevia? Yes, you can. You certainly can. Okay. Well, I think we're about 8 minutes past, so I'm hungry. I'm going to go home and eat. I got a roast waiting for me. But I want to say thank you for tuning in tonight and joining me with Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. I hope you come back next week for another episode. We're going to be talking about the liver. So if you need to learn more about the liver and detoxification and how certain things can impact your liver and detoxification, then make sure you mark your calendar for 6 p.m. Central Standard Time next week, and we'll see you here. In the meantime, go over to Gluten Free Society. Make sure you sign up for my newsletter there if you want to get updates about when we do live events and when we go live, but also if you want to get access to that leaky gut class that we've got coming out here very shortly. So until then, we'll see you next week. Have a fantastic evening. Take care. Hey, if you've got a functional medicine or health question that you'd like me to answer for you, make sure you send me an email, glutenology@gmail.com, and we'll do our best to create a video answer just for you. Have a great day.